Heyo! Welcome to Eric Rates Games, the channel that provides the most in-depth game reviews. There are a number of timestamps in the video below, so please feel free to jump around. Today, we'll be taking a look at The Last of Us Part 2, a sequel to The Last of Us. Before we begin, a warning that this review includes full spoilers from the original game and light spoilers from Part 2. I'll also be comparing and contrasting the two games, so feel free to check out my review for Part 1 before proceeding. The Last of Us Part 2 is an action-adventure game created by gaming studio Naughty Dog and originally released as a PlayStation 4 exclusive in June 2020. While it hasn't achieved its predecessor's 17 million units sold, it was a successful sequel, selling more than 10 million copies. The game received high marks from critics, but earned mixed reviews from a deeply divided fanbase. While most concede gameplay improvements, at question is whether the story lives up to the critically acclaimed prequel. So without delay, let's take a look at just that in the section ahead. In The Last of Us Part 2, you are Ellie, the tenacious young girl we know and love from Part 1. You are also Abby, a muscle-bound, abnormally strong girl that we learn is seeking out Joel. For those who didn't know, it is revealed that Ellie is gay, and a kissing incident last night at a local dance has set the town abuzz. The kiss occurred between Ellie and Dina, Ellie's secret crush, who, until recently, had been dating a mutual male friend, Jesse. The kiss prompts the local town bigot to harass the girls, leading to an altercation with Joel. Ellie's relationship with Joel is on the rocks, and she lashes out at his overprotectiveness. All of this leads to an awkward morning after, where Ellie must navigate Jesse, Dina, and others while preparing to go on patrol.
She kissed me.
I was talking about your fight with Seth. Wait, you kissed Dina?
Ellie gets paired with Dina, providing the perfect opportunity to sort out their true feelings. Meanwhile, Abby and a group of friends from a Seattle-based enclave have tracked Joel down seeking vengeance. You control Abby, who has her own interpersonal issues to sort out, as she tries to puzzle how her small troop is going to extract Joel from the large, well-fortified Jackson settlement.
Mel's pregnant.
Oh. Okay.
It's not just that, though.
Should I say congrats?
Serendipitously, Abby runs into Joel and Tommy while fleeing from a group of infected humans and convinces them to seek shelter at her group's nearby encampment. The Seattle crew takes full advantage of their unbelievable fortune, swiftly incapacitating the two brothers. Meanwhile, Jesse is looking for Dina and Ellie to inform them that Joel and Tommy missed the rendezvous. They split up to search, and Ellie finds Abby's hideout just in time to watch a brutalized Joel suffer a final blow by Abby's hand. In a surprising twist, Abby's close accomplice Owen convinces the Seattle squad to spare Tommy and Ellie as they aren't the target of the vengeance-fueled quest. Flash forward to the following days, and it is revealed that the town leader Maria won't spare members to seek out Joel's killers. Ellie is determined to go with or without help, and her new girlfriend Dina is committed to stay by her side. Tommy, meanwhile, has absconded from the camp to set out after his brother's murderers solo, prompting Maria to let Dina and Ellie leave the camp freely in hopes of aiding her husband.
Just, do me a favor and bring my dumbass husband home in one piece, please.
Thus, the driving action for the story has been established. While I'll try to avoid revealing any major remaining plot points, there are a few problems I see with the preceding actions. Before I get into those, let me start by addressing the elephant in the room. The beloved protagonist, played for a vast majority of the previous game, has been murdered and won't be played for the remainder of this game. This is a bold choice. I'm not saying it's a bad choice, but Naughty Dog had to know that a segment of their fanbase would be furious about the ruthless death of the character they bonded with and probably expected to play as when they purchased the game. I actually didn't mind this, as I'd personally rather be surprised, even at the expense of losing a key character, but it did end up negatively affecting the game. The reason for this is that Dina and Ellie aren't Joel and Ellie. In The Last of Us, we're shown Sarah, a sweet and loving young girl, tragically killed in the chaos of Outbreak Day. We see how it turns Joel into a cold, dry husk of his former self. We also learn about Ellie, a young girl who is scared, alone, and abandoned by everyone she meets. They are exactly what the other needs most in the world, and they slowly realize that as the story unfolds. Dina is a love interest. We don't know whether it's true love or a passing phase. In fact, we don't know anything about Dina prior to the game's first scenes, where her and Ellie's relationship unfolds. So while their dialogue is cute and clever...
Okay, I have a very serious question for you. How bad do I smell?
the connection lacks the backstory and uniqueness that adds the depth to Joel and Ellie's relationship from the first game. This point is reinforced during Ellie and Joel's first flashback scene. I instantly missed the well-crafted, carefully built chemistry and wondered, why was this just a cutscene versus the actual game I was playing?
I do okay.
Are you fucking kidding me?
The other critical error is that the driving action for The Last of Us Part 2 story doesn't make any sense. Consider the first game, where Joel is transporting Ellie across the country to rendezvous with fireflies that can leverage her immunity to create a vaccine. The objective is simple: travel to a location while staying alive. The reward for successfully completing the mission is world-altering, and therefore easily warrants the risk. In Part 2, the objective is suicidal, and there is no reward for completing the mission. The group that killed Joel had 8 members, and one would assume there are many more at their home base. We later learn from Abby that there are in fact thousands of wolves, the moniker taken by members of the Washington Liberation Front. Also worth remembering is that the world is dangerous, and that traveling from Jackson, Wyoming to Seattle carries a significant risk of being killed by infected or hostile survivors along the way. Now let's talk about the justification for the mission. Assuming the mission is somehow a success, what is the benefit? Killing the people responsible for Joel's death won't bring Joel back to life. If anything, it will create further strife between Jackson and Seattle, resulting in more war and more death. Add to this the fact that Joel was known to have a sordid past as a smuggler, where he crossed and killed any number of people, and it's not even clear that avenging his death would mean justice had been served. Hell, even Joel didn't seem to hold Abby's actions against her at the end.
Why don't you say whatever speech you got rehearsed? Get this over with.
Lastly, the members responsible for killing Joel spared both Tommy and Ellie because they had no quarrel with them. The mercy they showed was, if anything, morally superior to most humans shown in the post-apocalyptic world.
So they just get to get away with this?
Yes, Ellie, they do. For what it's worth, the game does seem to understand the absurdity of Ellie's actions by having supplemental characters occasionally question her, forcing retorts with flimsy logic.
You have no idea what you're walking into. You don't know how large that group is, how armed.
I don't care.
You ever worried they're gonna come back to Jackson after us?
What do you mean?
I mean, we're going through a lot of their people. In their city.
Because of what they did.
Didn't Abby and her friends come to Jackson because of something Joel did?
The problem here is that Ellie's single-minded quest for revenge, even at the cost of others' well-being, make her extremely unlikable. The sweet and spunky girl from the first game is long gone, and discerning players may even root against her by the end. Despite the shaky start, the story improves. Contrary to some, I actually enjoyed Abby's section, as she had a compelling backstory, interesting relationships with friends like Manny and Owen, and her actions and motivations made sense, at least at the start. The only downside to her section was the game frequently reminding you that she is inordinately strong. The original Last of Us championed women by showing Tessa's grit, Ellie's tenacity, and Maria's level-headed leadership. The Last of Us Part 2 seems to want to take that one step further and declare that there are no differences between women and men at all.
Ladies first. He said ladies first.
The story itself gets more complex and interweaves Ellie's and Abby's actions into some very poignant moments. Some people were critical of the overarching morbidity, going so far as to label it misery porn. My take is that what matters most is not whether the outcomes are happy or sad, but how effectively those emotions are drawn out of players. From this perspective, The Last of Us Part 2 did have some shining moments. Just when I thought the story had course corrected, issues resurfaced. New characters are introduced and make irrational decisions that put themselves and those they care about in mortal danger. They are told that the consequences from these actions aren't their fault, while in reality they are basically entirely their fault. I couldn't help but think the story may have actually been better if portions of it had been removed. It doesn't get any better from there, with the final confrontation between Abby and Ellie ending in utter lunacy. While playing, I was left verbally exclaiming my confusion at the television. Further perplexing is the game continues beyond what feels like the unquestionable end, in what I can only describe as a sort of epilogue. The driving action and outcomes of the epilogue are as flawed as ever, and again beg the question, would the story have been better without it? To summarize, while I think the game took a bold approach, continued its history of strong voice acting, and had some quality reveals with powerful scenes, the baffling driving actions, hard to connect with characters, and perplexing final scenes left the story discernibly worse than the original. This may explain why the game has been met with so many mixed reviews from fans. The Gameflow in The Last of Us 2 follows the original. Players swap between narrative, exploration, and combat, oftentimes preceded by terrain that can't be retraced once crossed. While the narrative and combat are typically interesting, the exploration is choppy. This is once again due to the lack of a map combined with the linear storyline. There were some improvements, including characters sometimes providing verbal cues, but there were still plenty of times where I found myself walking in circles. Even worse, there were certain areas where the merciful hint function was either bugged or designed not to flash, despite plenty of time spent wandering. Pro tip: sometimes NPCs will hang out around, or even take, the route going forward. In what felt like an epic troll, the game actually does provide a map during a specific section of Ellie's Seattle storyline, even going so far as to cross off successfully cleared buildings. This map was extremely helpful and made playing the area far more enjoyable. It also struck a nice balance between not explicitly showing you where to go, while giving you a reference point to collect your bearings. I'm still not sure why this feature was only available in that one specific section, but if a Part 3 were to ever release, I would highly recommend incorporating this map into the entire game. I will say that there was an option I found after beating the game that orients your character in the proper direction when pressing L3, which is a great addition, but something that I felt like should have been a default setting rather than buried in a submenu. Circling back to the exploration, just like in the previous game, there are sometimes puzzles that must be solved in order to progress to the next area. I will say that these puzzles are more complex than their mundane counterparts in Part 1. They incorporate new elements like breaking windows with bricks, going prone to crawl under obstacles, making running leaps, using cords to swing across gaps, and even incorporating timing on occasion. Many of the puzzles revolve around locked doors that indicate an alternative entrance to the area beyond. While much improved, I still wouldn't call the puzzles amazing, and more often than not, progressing simply comes down to looking in the right direction at the right time. Another unpleasant aspect to Gameflow is the resource and ammo collection. While I think making limited resources part of the game is a must, the way resources are evenly spread out incentivizes players to look in every drawer of every room. The number of safes and other special stockpiles is marginally improved from the first game, but a majority of the extra supplies are still sitting around on tables or in drawers adjacent to the progression path. I still think the game should have larger caches of resources either A, fall from defeated enemies, or B, only exist in special areas where players do something clever to uncover them. Increasing the maximum amount of carryable ammo could help bridge the gap between these more infrequent caches and result in less time performing mundane scavenging. One positive Gameflow improvement is that the slow jog is limited to sections with heavy narrative, allowing higher mobility for a majority of exploration. While there was unquestionably some progress with Gameflow, the overall feel remains choppy and there is room for additional improvements in the future. The combat in The Last of Us is mostly unchanged from the original. The scenes are broken down into encounters, which occur in random areas along the linear progression path. They alternate between groups of human and infected enemies, and at a high level are pretty interesting. The encounters remain challenging. The enemies are numerous, do a lot of damage, and oftentimes attack from different angles. The focus remains on stealth killing as many enemies as possible, to preserve ammo and prevent other adversaries from swarming. A key tool to doing this is listen mode. This can reveal enemies in the area, especially if they are making sound by either moving or talking. The flip side to this is ensuring you stay hidden and quiet. Crouching and moving slowly will make it harder for packs of enemies to notice you, and a new ability to go prone is particularly effective when done in tall grass. Pro tip: aiming in tall grass is difficult, but can be accomplished by cycling between your sights and third-person view to calibrate the shot. Upon dying, players are returned to the most recent checkpoint within the encounter. There is an option to restart from the last checkpoint, as well as a new option to restart the whole encounter. This is actually useful, as in the previous game you could accidentally kill an enemy that triggered a checkpoint prior to restarting. While all of the above works well, I still think rewarding a more aggressive playstyle through better ammo drops on slain enemies would give players an alternative fun game approach. Moving into the details, some of the same inefficiencies from part 1, like having to exchange weapons from a bag and having to aim before shooting, persist. Movement is still awkward, as changing directions and walking are typically done separately. The same challenges to effective weapon use carry over from part 1 and include: number 1, enemy movement is quick and erratic. 2, the weapon reticle only narrows upon uninterrupted focus. 3, being hit or grabbed interrupts the aiming process. 4, weapons have a default sway effect. 5, there is a delay between firing rounds even when a gun has ammo. 6, switching out or reloading weapons take a long time. Pro tip: make sure all of your guns have the maximum number of bullets loaded prior to starting an encounter. Melee weapons are still deadlier than pistols, especially when paired with the upgrade that gives full durability repair and makes every hit lethal. I will say that it did feel a little harder to melee an enemy head-on, as once interrupted by a gunshot, it's difficult to recover. Melee weapons also seemed less likely to be lying around. The bow is also a little reworked. It's a bit harder to operate effectively and only has a chance to preserve arrows upon delivering a headshot. I felt like this was a fair trade for the uncanny damage it does. The available guns and ammo are similar to the previous game, although Ellie and Abby get mostly unique arsenals. I did like this approach as it provided a little variety to their playthroughs. Other differences include Ellie's switchblade, which appears to be made from adamantium, versus Abby, who despite having access to a military-grade assault rifle, hasn't progressed beyond prison shank technology. By and large, the game still disincentivizes guns due to limited ammo, limited damage, and the consequence of alerting enemies to your presence. I think this is too bad, as to me, the precision aim required for using guns successfully is the most enjoyable aspect of combat. Overall, I thought the weapon design and variety was nice. There is still a mix of weapons that are effective at various ranges, and certain weapons work better against certain enemies. For example, the larger undead enemies are typically weak to fire. Like the weapons, the craftable items remain the same or similar to the first game. Some are unique to Ellie and Abby, and some are shared. The shared items include the health kit, silencer, and melee upgrade. Ellie gets access to stun bombs, which make affected enemies susceptible to melee kills, smoke bombs that obscure vision, proximity mines that act like claymores, the Molotov cocktail, which does AoE fire damage, and the ability to craft arrows. Abby's proprietary items include pipe bombs, which are basically grenades, a shiv, as she hasn't bothered to acquire a knife, and the ability to craft both hunting pistol ammo and incendiary shells for her double-barreled shotgun. Similar to Part 1, throwable items like Molotov cocktails and bombs replace your weapon and thus should only be used when you have the time to properly aim and throw them uninterrupted. All items are crafted from 6 unique resources, and each resource is used to create more than one item. This was an improvement I suggested from the first game. Pro tip: avoid maxing out your crafted items in case you find them in the open world. I still wish the game wasn't so strict with the number of storable items and ammo. It seems logical to reward players who are able to preserve their ammunition instead of forcing them to leave precious ammo behind. Throwable bottles and bricks work exactly the same by allowing players to distract, stun, or strike enemies with them. Only one can be carried at a time, but they appear quite frequently. Another cool change to combat worth covering is the dodge function. You can now press L1 to avoid melee strikes from most enemies. This is a great change, adding a timing-based element to combat and making the overall lack of mobility less punitive. Pro tip: some enemies will chain attacks together and require consecutive dodges before safely counterattacking. Also worth mentioning is that there are new infected enemy types. The first are Shamblers, who expel an acidic spray and have higher than average health compared to the regular infected. Next are Stalkers. These infected move quietly and spend time hiding or flanking instead of running forward in predictable patterns. They also move quietly, making them harder to detect in listening mode. The new enemy types are welcome additions, as the runner-clicker-bloater triad from the first game lacked much variety. Lastly, I must regrettably mention that The Last of Us Part 2 commits a cardinal sin in pitting Ellie against well-trained good boys and girls used by the Washington Liberation Front. While it's possible to avoid most encounters with dogs, it is often difficult to do so, and once noticed, there is no choice but to defend yourself or get bitten to death. After conferring with the judges, I am penalizing The Last of Us Part 2 with the first ever ERG red card, and will deduct 1 rating point from the final score. To wrap up combat, the overall format and layout remains interesting, and I like certain challenging elements like precision aiming and picking the right weapon for a given situation. Improvements from added features like dodging, going prone, and improved friendly AI make a noticeable impact, and the new enemy types add depth. Legacy issues like limited movement, being forced to aim before shooting, slow reloading, and lengthy weapon swapping still make fighting a little clunky at times, but overall I had a positive combat experience. Leveling in The Last of Us Part 2 follows the same pattern as Part 1. First is finding new unlockable weapons and items. These are probably the game's most significant upgrades, as wielding weapons like the shotgun and flamethrower make killing enemies a lot easier. Interestingly, a number of better weapons like the hunting pistol, shotgun, and flamethrower must be found instead of being automatically unlocked during certain points in the story. Training manuals are reimagined in The Last of Us Part 2 and unlock new skill trees of upgrades rather than simply providing passive buffs. The skill tree benefits are activated using collected pills but must be unlocked sequentially. While I like the expanded leveling, the forced linear progression felt like an unnecessary restriction, and I'm not sure why it was enforced. Gears that enable players to improve weapons at work tables persist from the previous title, but there are no longer tools that limit certain weapon upgrades. This is because weapon upgrades don't have multiple tiers like in the first game. To offset the lower number of upgrades per weapon, tiers appear in smaller quantities. Overall, I didn't mind the changes, although I will say I didn't have enough gears to perform upgrades at around half of the work tables I came across. This makes sense though, as leveling must be paced throughout the longer game so that weapons only fully upgrade near the end. Like the first game, the weapon upgrades generally affect magazine size, reload speed, fire rate, range, and damage. Overall, I'd say the leveling system is slightly improved, though quite similar to the first game. Having 5 unique skill trees was nice, and I still enjoyed the separation of the personal and weapon upgrades, and the distinct forms of leveling flow well as the game progresses. Per usual, The Last of Us has an in-game menu and a settings menu. The in-game menu is broken into 3 tabs: crafting, leveling up, and collectibles. These menus are almost exactly the same as Part 1, although they take up less of your screen to provide more vision to incoming threats. For crafting, the current inventory of crafted items is shown below, while the amounts of collectible resources are shown on top via highlighted icons. Holding X converts the illuminated resources into the inventory items below. An additional feature in Part 2 is that items that share crafting resources will flash to help warn you against accidentally using crafting material needed for a more important item. The skills menu is also straightforward, showing current pills, all unlocked skill trees, and skills beneath them that are either unlocked or can be upgraded. You use the right and left D-pad to navigate between trees, and up and down to select the given skill. Just like with items, holding X converts the collected pills into the skill, which then switches from gray to white. Last, for the in-game menu, are the collectibles. These include the documents labeled artifacts that most often tell stories of people venturing through the hostile world. They can also contain references to safe combos or other helpful information. Next are collectible cards or coins, depending on whether you're playing Ellie or Abby, and a record of all collected training manuals. Similar to the first game's comic books, coins and trading cards serve no practical purpose and make the challenge of finding them less fulfilling. Next is the settings menu, and holy crap, this might be the most thorough settings menu I've ever seen. In stark contrast to the limited adjustments from the first game, The Last of Us Part 2 offers a veritable customization bonanza. Not only are there 5 difficulty levels, but you can apply those difficulty settings to yourself, enemies, allies, stealth, and resources individually. Controls have near full customization, not only for the default combat, but for operating vehicles, interacting with terrain, and even playing the guitar. There are numerous HUD adjustment options, including an alternate weapon aim reticle and adjusting the size of on-screen displays. Settings for skipping puzzles, preventing falling off ledges, assisting in jumping across difficult gaps, and the L3 orientation setting that I thought should be the default exist in the navigation and traversal accessibility menu. Lastly, the combat accessibility provides a plethora of options to reduce the difficulty of certain aspects of combat. These include stopping enemies from flanking, becoming invisible while going prone, getting rid of weapon sway, and straight up slowing time. While most players will probably use few, if any, of these settings, I was blown away by how much customization players could apply to their playthrough. For controls, the left joystick dictates movement, while the right joystick regulates vision. L3 is reserved for triggering a hint when stuck in an area, or looking at a given cue when prompted, while R3 toggles on and off your flashlight. The touchpad opens up the in-game menu, while the options button opens the settings menu. For the D-pad, up and down D-pad cycle through items, while left and right cycle through weapons. R2 reloads when not aiming and fires the equipped weapon when aiming with L2. Holding down L1 enables running, while holding down R1 activates listening mode. R1 can also be tapped to cycle through holstered weapons. For buttons, triangle is used to grab supplies or interact with certain objects. X is used for jumping, climbing, or toggling a weapon scope while aiming. Circle is used to alternate between crouching and standing, or can be held to go prone, while square triggers melee attacks. The default controls are largely the same from the first game, and while the customizability is way better than the original, the biggest problem I had from the first game remains. You can't fire without aiming because fire and reload are both bound to R2. Worse still, the fire and reload actions can't be separated when customizing controls. I still don't understand why triangle and X need to be their own buttons. It would make some sense if the jump action was commonly used, but it rarely is. It seems like the tap versus hold feature, already in use for R1 or circle, could enable mapping all interactions to X, thus freeing up triangle for reload. Despite this issue, I did like that you could swap L3 for sprint and R3 for crouch, and was impressed that customization options extended beyond base controls. Another small but noticeable improvement was holding down triangle to interact with inanimate obstacles instead of pressing it repeatedly. While not perfect, the controls for The Last of Us 2 are certainly improved. Audio and visuals remain a strong point for the franchise. While the difference between the remastered version and The Last of Us Part 2 is obviously less noticeable, as both were built for the PS4, the world is bigger and still looks great. The audio is mostly ambient and dialogue focused, but the sounds are all believable, and the creepy cries from the various infected can really set the scene. The voice acting is skillfully done with many new characters.
Sorry I grew up. You should try it.
Oh yeah, how do I do that? Should I go find the people that killed my family? Cut into them? I could torture them until they're crying, you know?
And while the story had flaws, the sequence of cutscenes in the Last of Us franchise is the closest thing I've seen to a movie-quality production inside a PS4 game. There were also 2 fixes to the overlay that I suggested in my last review, including making bricks and bottles shimmer only when currently unequipped, and displaying the loaded bullets separately from the ammo in reserve. An added overlay feature is a wrench icon that will indicate when you've collected a resource that enables creating a previously uncraftable item. These updates, combined with all the customizable HUD options, make the user interface greatly improved. Lastly, the shops and scenery encountered throughout Seattle are skillfully done and at many points precisely replicate specific shops or notable architecture like the convention center. I actually live in a suburb outside of Seattle, and while I don't wander downtown often, I confirmed with people who do that the game showed impressive recreations of many of their smaller neighborhoods. The general consensus is that The Last of Us Part 2 has about 26 hours of story and considerably more for those who want to thoroughly explore each area. My personal playthrough was about 27 hours, making the game 70% longer than the original. While still a bit shorter than some of its peers, the heavy narrative adds weight to each of these hours and gives a full game experience to users. I'd even go so far as to say certain sections, particularly the epilogue, felt misplaced, and the game may have been improved without them. However, from a strictly length perspective, the game is clearly superior to the original. While there will always be limited replay value to a narrative-focused linear game, The Last of Us Part 2 does offer a couple of new features. To start, the new Game Plus option, various rewards, and increased difficulty settings persist from the original. In addition to these, a new Extras menu is unlocked upon beating the game. The Extras menu lets players trade points accumulated by finding certain items, completing challenges, or beating the game on higher difficulty settings for bonus content. The bonus content includes concept art from various sections of the game, character models, render modes that add unique visual themes, and cheats that can be used in future playthroughs. The art is fine, but the render modes and cheats were actually more fun than I expected. Here are a couple examples of a fight using different cheats and render modes. For the above reasons, I would say that the length and replay value is improved from the original. One aspect that is not improved is the multiplayer and co-op. This is because neither exist. The Factions multiplayer from the prequel was originally going to be included at release, but was later scrapped. Naughty Dog has since planned to incorporate the multiplayer mode into its own spin-off game, with new content that they will make available for you to purchase, rather than including for free in the original game. How thoughtful. While yet to be released, recent announcements seem to indicate the game is nearing completion. Let me start by stating The Last of Us Part 2 is not a one-star game. People who rate it that way are hyper-focusing on a specific flaw instead of objectively looking at the game in its entirety. There's a lot this game does well. In fact, apart from the story and the multiplayer, it seems clear that The Last of Us Part 2 improves on most elements of the prequel. These enhancements include new enemy types, techniques like dodging and going prone, new items and weapons, tons of customization, better controls, better puzzles, and a significantly longer story. The only problem is that the Last of Us franchise made its name by having the best story the industry had ever seen. And there are enough issues, including awful driving actions, unlikable characters, and a confounding ending that make the story far inferior to Part 1. It's kind of like going to a sporting event at a new stadium with comfier seats, better tasting beer, and the world's biggest jumbotron, but then watching your team lose in the final minutes. I don't want to be overly critical of the story, as the voice acting was strong, and there were some interesting twists and heart-wrenching scenes. It's important to realize that the story would be less maligned had the prequel not existed. However, given that plot and narrative are the franchise's main attraction, and deducting 1 point for mistreatment of doggos, I'm giving The Last of Us Part 2 an ERG rating of 86. Do let me know what you think in the comments below, and feel free to recommend the next game deserving an ERG rating. Last but not least, do please like and subscribe if you found this review enjoyable and would like to support me creating additional content. Thank you all so much, and I hope to see you again soon.